My name is Megan Givens, and with me today is my classmate Mallory Little. We are speech-language pathology graduate students, and we would like to give a brief overview of the Clinical Evaluation of Language Fundamentals 5th edition, which is also known as the Celf 5.
Okay, so just to start, the Celf 5 is a standardized test that can be used for the identification, diagnosis, and follow-up evaluation of language and communication disorders. It is appropriate for children or adults ages 5 to 21 years old, and it can be administered by speech-language pathologists, school psychologists, special educators, or diagnosticians.
So some areas that this language test assesses is receptive language, expressive language, which includes spoken and written aspects and areas of that, and also social language skills.
Okay, so this test has 8 subtests, and you get scaled scores for each of those subtests, and those 8 subtests are sentence comprehension, linguistic concepts, word structure, following directions, formulated sentences, recalling sentences, understanding spoken paragraphs, and the pragmatics profile.
There are 5 different core language scores and index scores that are provided on the protocol in order to assess the language abilities of a client. The first one is a core language scale, which is a measure of general language ability. Next, we have a receptive language index, which is a measure of a student's listening and auditory comprehension skills. The third one is expressive language index, which is an overall measure of a student's expressive language skills. Next, we have a language content index score, which is a measure of various aspects of semantic development. And then lastly, we have a language structure index, which is an overall measure of receptive and expressive components of interpreting and producing sentence structures.
The Celf 5 also has some supplementary testing that can be used in conjunction with the core language test, and that includes reading and writing supplements. One is for children ages 8 to 10, and the other is for children ages 11 to 21. And there is also an observational rating scale that can be filled out by a teacher or the clinician, however is most appropriate.
Here are the test scaled scores that you can get when evaluating and interpreting the client's language abilities. We do gather a raw score and then get a scaled score from the raw score. And then from those scores, we can get a confidence interval, percentile rank, age equivalence, and growth scale value.
Okay, so the test scaled scores are for the 8 subtests that I mentioned previously. And as Megan pointed out, there are different scores for each of those 8 subtests. Well, then, for scoring, you take the scaled scores of each of those individual subtests, and they are combined to give you the core language score and index scores. For example, the core language score is a combination of sentence comprehension, word structure, formulated sentences, and recalling sentences. So the different core language scores that can be taken from a combination of the 8 test scale scores are core language score, receptive language index, expressive language index, language content index, and language structure index. And for each of those core language scores, we can get a sum of the scaled scores, a standard score points, which give us confidence intervals, percentile ranks, and a percentile rank confidence interval. Okay, so some reasons why you should choose the Celf 5. One is that in response to intervention, it can be used with levels 2, the tiers 2 and 3, and it's used frequently in those tier levels. Also, For the reliability for the Celf 5, reliability is the accuracy, consistency, and stability of the scores across situations. So in other words, if the same unchanged student is tested more than once in a similar environment, his scores will stay the same. Part of reliability is internal consistency, which estimates the consistency of the items of a test, and for all tests other than structured writing, the reliability coefficients were considered either excellent or good, which is evidence that the internal consistency of the Celf 5 is good and reliable. Another aspect of reliability is the test-retestability, which is the correlation between test and retest scores, and evidence that is explained in the manual. The Celf 5 manual explains that average corrected stability coefficients of the composite scores are all good to excellent, ranging from 0.83 to 0.907, which indicates that the Celf's test-retestability is reliable. In addition to reliability, we can look at a test validity, which is the degree to which evidence supports that a test measures the concepts it purports to, and that it's applicable to its intended population. And you can get evidence based on content, response processes, internal structure, and relationships with other variables. For content, evidence proves that the Celf 5 assesses nearly all aspects of receptive language and is therefore valid in that way. Evidence about response processes indicates that the desired response processes are being effectively elicited in the Celf 5. There is evidence that relationships with other variables is how a test relates to other tests that is designed to measure the same or similar constructs. And so the Celf 4 has a high correlation with the Celf 4, and it also there is a moderate to high correlation between the Celf 5 and the PPVT4 and the EVT2 test scores. So that shows that it is valid based on relationships with other variables and internal structure. Most of the Celf 5 tests correlate moderately with one another for individuals without language delay or other developmental disorders. So that tells us that the internal structure, the evidence about the internal structure proves that the Celf 5's validity.
Now we would like to explain how this test works by demonstrating a few of the subtests. So we would like for you to imagine that you have your protocol and stimulus book in front of you, and let's keep in mind that when scoring this test, when the client gets a response correct, we circle 1, and then whenever they get it incorrect, we circle 2. And a ceiling is reached when there are 4 consecutive scores of 0 in a row.
Okay, so I'm going to explain the sentence comprehension task. During this task, the clinician flips the stimulus book open to the sentence comprehension portion, and on the first page on the pages that are used during this task, there are 4 pictures that are divided by lines on a page, and they're similar, but they are not identical. And the clinician would ask the client, she would say, point to the picture, the girl has a big spotted black and white dog. And so the client would then have to look at the stimulus, look at all 4 pictures, and point to the one that is a picture of the girl has a big spotted black and white dog. And as Megan said, the clinician would continue throughout the test booklet. For instance, the next one is point to the girl who is standing in front of the line is wearing a backpack. And so the clinician would continue to prompt the client to respond to each of these stimuli. The next portion that we are going to demonstrate is linguistic concepts. And similar to sentence comprehension, the clinician is using the stimulus book, and you flip to the linguistic concepts page, and the page has different pictures that are in a row, and the clinician would prompt the client by saying, point to the house and a flower. And now on the page there are many different small pictures in a line across the page, and the client will be expected to point to a house and a flower. The next one would say, point to the flower in the middle. And on this page there are 3 different flowers in a row, and the client would be expected to point to the flower that's in the middle. And so again, you would continue administering the test items until the client misses 4 consecutive, until the client scores 0 on 4 consecutive items.
Now we're going to move to the word classes section. And this section, we are looking at 3 pictures on one page, and the clinician will say to the client, I'm going to say some words and show you some pictures, and I want you to tell me which 2 words that you think go together best. So for instance, this first question, or this first item on this section, has a picture of a cow, a cat, and a kitten. And so the clinician will say, here's a cow, a cat, and a kitten. Which 2 words do you think go best together? And the client, an expected response would be the client would point to the cat and the kitten. The next subtest we're going to move to is formulated sentences. And here we have a picture of a scene. The clinician will say, here is a picture. Now you make a sentence about this picture using the word she. You must make your sentence about something in the picture, and you must use the word she. And so an expected response would be something like, she is washing her hands. And to record this response, the clinician will write down verbatim what the client has said, and additional scoring will take place to measure the content that the client is using in her sentence formulation.
Pragmatics profile is a rating scale that can be filled out by the clinician with help from the child's parents or teachers, and it assesses the child's pragmatic use of language, such as, do they make and respond to greetings to and from others? Do they begin and end conversations? Do they give and ask for directions appropriately? And the clinician will rate the client's performance in pragmatics based on their observation or information obtained from the parents. And they rate on a scale of 1 to 4. 1 stands for never or almost never. 2 stands for sometimes. 3 stands for often. And 4 stands for almost or always or almost always. So, to sum it up, our general impression of the Celf 5 is that it really assesses a wide variety of language skills. It hits receptive language, expressive language, pragmatics, and then the different 8 subtests, they just assess a wide variety of those language skills. So we really liked that. It also is fairly easy to administer. Once you figure out how to flip through the stimulus book and score the Celf 5, It's pretty easy to administer. As far as how engaging it is for the client, we feel that the pictures are very colorful, and because the client is required to respond, which is my next point, because the client is required to respond both verbally and non-verbally, we believe that in addition to the colorful pictures, will keep the client engaged. There are a few things that we thought might not be so great, is that it could take a long time to administer depending on the child and how many tests you decide to give, because we read that it should take 30 to 45 minutes to do the core language test, but that if you were to do the supplemental testing measures, that could take a little bit longer. And in addition, an uncooperative child, this test could begin to take a very long time. It was fairly easy to score and interpret. The protocol was a little bit overwhelming at times, but once you figure it out and know what values go where, then it was overall pretty easy to score and interpret. And we also liked that it combined the 8 subtests into the core language scores, which give a good indication of whether receptive language or expressive language is being targeted for each of those subtests. So we really liked that as well. Do you have anything to add?